Hello everyone. I'm still also practicing to pronounce my name, so it's Maryna Henrysson. And thank you so much for coming. And I want to especially thank to my committee members for accepting to review the work and actually doing it over the summer holidays. So thank you. And so I'm here today to talk about my dissertation work, which is on governance of low-carbon societies and low-carbon development. So essentially, it's about politics of development and climate change. So I hope that this discussion today will, well, not only explain the word ideational, but also will be useful for you, and you will live with a thought about why is it important to talk about transformation in a wider context of visions about sustainability and interpretations of sustainability. So in my time, I will talk about 4 Ws. I'll talk about what my research is concerned with, then how I set up the study, what are the findings, how did I go about it, so what is the research strategy and the conceptual framework, and I will present empirical grounds for the analysis from 3 case studies, and well, outline the cross-cutting contribution and talk a bit about what does it mean for policy and for general contribution to literature. So sustainability from the beginning of the policy debate has been a contested matter. There are those who argue that achieving long-term sustainability requires a radical change, transformation, along with institutional advancement and regulatory advancement. While there are others who suggest that incremental change will be enough. So from where I come from, as an interdisciplinary scientist of sustainability, I agree that this issue has to be approached and is approached from a variety of perspectives. So for me, what is the most interesting and the most intriguing part of governance of climate change is the politics of climate change. Like, what is the question that I'm mostly concerned about is what makes change happen. So how does change get, how change gets instigated? And if put in the words of Margaret Atwood, like, climate change is about everything. So it doesn't really make it easy in terms of designing the research project. So I approach this theme of, well, everything as presenting a social and technical challenge of staggering proportions. So for me, it's a problem of governance. Choices between contending governance, institutional and infrastructural pathways, each claiming various versions of transformation and sustainability and development are profoundly political. So these choices raise questions about who will govern transformation, what institutions will be involved, and how agreements on what to be transformed will be made, as well as on whose terms our trade-off between competing policy objectives will be resolved. So the climate change mitigation is increasingly evident in international and national discourses of development and green growth. Literature debates are shifting from discussing low-carbon transformation in pure terms of technological transitions to include a wider political economy perspective. Yet, literature on development and climate change mitigation in developing countries is still missing, and in particular in the domain of politics in the global south. So at the same time, in the political science, research around drivers of political change, such as agency, contestation, and discursive diversity, has been developing, and those are critical in talking about transformation, since the diversity of those visions is at the core of it. So ultimately, for me, political, domestic, and discursive are crucial and are detrimental in defining development pathways. So understanding this is particularly important in order to ensure that reflexive mitigation policy arrangements which are efficient, effective, legitimate, and have a full-scale, long-term political support are in place. So how did I go about it? The aim of this research is to enhance understanding of how political agendas of climate change mitigation and development are framed by ideas of sustainability. So it is about how ideas of what constitutes sustainability and transformational change influence the governance. So essentially, it's an investigation into assumptions embedded in the construction of policy problems, the political agendas of present-day policies, and the development pathways imperatives in the context of responses to climate change mitigation and energy system reforms. So this big and rather broad question is supported by three smaller research questions, but they're not that small. So three other research questions. So the first one, and they're like basically two groups. One is what, and the other two is how and when. So the first one is aims to draw attention to those predominant narratives around development and transformation and climate change mitigation. So I look into how policy problems are defined, and so what are the solutions, what are the governance solutions that are suggested by these definitions. And the other two are, they help to look into the dynamics of the institutionalization and institutional processes, and they help to explore who cares, and well, who cares as well, and what is the dynamics of this institutional change. So, first of all, I've developed a conceptual framework based on the literature. And then I tested this conceptual framework. So first of all, I looked into the rational, realist accounts in political science, but essentially I decided that constructive institutionalism provides a better lens to look at the problems that I've defined as a research problem. So in this context, I adopt and test this discursive institutionalism approach. And well, I started with policy arrangement approach, and it was sort of my first idea, and it does allow to explain organizational parts of policy, because it also looks at it's supposed to look at the dynamics of policy arrangement, and it distinguish between four different parts of this tetrahedron. Oh gosh, it's a word that's really hard to pronounce. And it also includes discourses and the aspect of power. But in my opinion, it doesn't really help exploring those why and how questions. So I turn to the discourse of institutionalism as developed by Vivian Schmidt. And when I started this research, it had been sort of a new approach, and it wasn't really well developed in terms of analytical tools, and wasn't really helpful in terms of how to go about it. So conceptually, it provided me a way of treating ideas and as like political institutions as embedded ideas, meaning structures and constructs, policy as political ideas adopted by actors based on their conceptualizations of reality, interests as rooted in ideas, and changes derived from transformative power of ideas. So it is an agent-centered view, and it does allow to see institutional context in a dynamic way. So in this approach, institutional context can be seen as formal and informal institutions external to actors that might constrain or empower them through the same logic as rational institutionalism, like incentive structures and established past dependencies or frames and culturally accepted norms. But at the same time, it treats institutions as where the agency, and then this is where the dynamic parts come, where institutional context includes the structures and construct of meaning that are internal to the agents, and the background ideational abilities of these agents allow them to enable them to create and maintain the institutions, when the foreground abilities allow them to reflect and critically approach the institutions. So what did I take from this? To help me look at the ideas, which is, well, it is quite an abstract and not easy to grasp term, has been pointed out to me by many people who read and reviewed my work over these years. So I used it to divide them into the levels, and as Discourse of Institutions suggests, they generally are 3 different levels of, well, generality. It's philosophy, which could be, well, like big ideologies such as neoliberalism, and programmatic. Those are like policy and also the tools that are envisioned within them and approaches. And then, well, policy is actually product of it, so like actual policy mechanisms. And to interpret the role of actors and the role of agency, I used the concept of power, that the way it's suggested in Discourse of Institutionalism, and here also three levels of it, and, well, 3 mechanisms of exercising it. There is a persuasive power, which is realized through the ideas, and coercive power, which is power over ideas, and structural power is, well, power of ideas in the institutional structure. So I know it's also quite an abstract one, actually. So with this in mind, I turned to testing this on the ground, and I was very interested to see if actually such level of, well, generality and such an abstract approach can actually be applied to studying institutions. So I have 4 cases, which are also 4 papers at the end, but I'm going to talk about 3 of them, where the climate change and low carbon development policy arena in Vietnam is the central one, and it also includes 2 other cases of baseline setting in energy efficiency in buildings and electricity infrastructure reform in Mexico and Vietnam. So there are 4 articles that are outputs of the case studies, and well, one of them is co-authored with, actually 2 of them are co-authored with people that are present here today. And I'm just going to jump quickly to the findings and not really going to talk more about the articles. So the second case study, which is a 3rd paper, is about policy, climate change mitigation policy arena in Vietnam. And I looked at the dynamics within it between the period of 2008 and 2015. And it examines the institutional arrangements, key discourses, and key actors that are involved in construction of the policy responses. So 3 things are important here. There are 2 parallel policy arenas that are relevant for low carbon development, and they share key discourses around development, namely ecological modernization and green growth discourse. And these are evident in programmatic and policy responses that approach both climate change mitigation and green growth primarily as an economic issue. And they rest on the principles of similar principles of flexible, adaptable generality, such as liberalization, market centrality, target setting, subsidies, institutional arrangement, reform, and both include rather ambiguous interpretations of sustainability. At the same time, in both policy arenas are centered around a strong emphasis on the role of on the state function as part of appealing to the moral responsibility to respond to climate change and socioeconomic general socioeconomic development priorities. So governance approaches that are envisioned within these frameworks follow linear transitions approach that favor incremental adjustments and prioritize a growth-oriented development mode. Both of these discourses and policy projects are presented as projects of a national importance and well referred as the cause of the entire party, all the people, all levels of government, and at the same time, what I found interesting that regardless this rhetoric, a very limited amount of actors was actually involved in producing both policy arenas. And well, as I said, two processes run in parallel. The climate change mitigation policy was introduced largely by the Ministry of Environment and those who participated in global response and negotiations under UNFCCC, and was largely developed with the assistance from the international donor community. At the same time, green growth strategy, well, while it was also developed with assistance from international organizations, it's been appropriated by Ministry of Planning and Investment and response to the government development agenda and interest built into their social economic development strategies. Well, it was designed with a consultation of various stakeholders. It's widely perceived as a domain of Ministry of Planning and Investment, and most of the respondents refer to it as, well, as a territory of that ministry. What I also found interesting was that green growth strategy is presented as a cornerstone of the development approach, and is also referred to as green growth by the people and for the people, and calls for the restructuring of the economy and clean industrialization. While it doesn't, well, it does refer to the change of the well economy as such. It doesn't really include the wider socioeconomic change of, well, political order or economic order, and it does refer to growth as green growth as fast, efficient, and sustainable. At the same time, responding to the needs of climate change strategy, and it does build on the rhetoric of earlier wide socioeconomic response known as Doimoi, and been also often referred to as Green Doimoi project. The second case, well, the third case in the second paper is well, it's co-authored with Søren Lutkin, who's here, and Daniel Pug, who is, well, probably here as well today. And the key three things we found interesting here. So it's a case study where we look at the development of nationally appropriate mitigation action, the policy in energy efficiency in building sector in Vietnam, and so three things. The policy domain around climate change mitigation and energy efficiency is dominated by the international techno-managerial discourse of carbon accounting, and it adds to already existing institutional challenges in the sectorial policymaking in energy efficiency in building sector. This instrumentalist and managerial conception of grounds for policy are driven by the experts, and they are expert-driven framings that are translated by international actors, because in the due to the limited capacity of the and limited national expertise, responsibility, for example, for development methodology and establishing baselines in particular, and data requirements was left with northern experts. So that did introduce these norms into national political discourse. So in this case, judgments about the policy evidence are normative judgments and are as much a product of power dynamics and institutional context as availability of hard data. The third case is a case of energy sector reforms in electricity sector in Mexico and Vietnam. And so what are the key things here is, well, first of all, the energy sector reforms here preceded the introduction of climate change mitigation in national policy discourse in both countries. Electricity supply and climate change mitigation are framed as the project of both project of public, including wider international community interest, but they also serve as means to justify further sectorial reforms and legitimize government and private interest, especially as the power sector transitions from state monopoly to liberalized market. So liberal environmentalism, ecological modernization with a focus on efficiency gains from technological innovation, and the national interpretation of green growth that is coupled with environmental sustainability are the main frameworks of the programmatic responses. The findings suggest that the continuity of existing exclusive rather than inclusive forms of energy governance with mixing signals about how the markets should change is present in both countries with a different degree. So political framework of climate change serves preserve incumbent energy frameworks, and centralized traditional models of fossil fuel-based energy continue to dominate both sectors. And it's not only, we argue, it's not only because of technological lock-ins, but also due to discursive or ideational lock-ins that are justified and legitimized through these background ideas about what energy supply and access to energy actually means. But despite the rhetoric in both countries, both governments retain the centralized power over renewable energy and climate change mitigation policy responses. So what does this all mean? What these three lines of analysis based on the research questions and the case study findings might suggest about the role of ideas for climate change mitigation, dynamics of continuity or change here in the context of transformational change. So what are the ideas? There are three ideas that are common for all the cases discussed in this dissertation, and those are of liberal environmentalism, ecological modernization, and green growth interpreted in the national terms. So ecological modernization suggests top-down regulation of it's a top-down governance arrangement, and it suggests that technologies are global goods, while liberal environmentalism suggests that market-motivated and market-inspired mechanisms are important to achieve green growth. So in Vietnam, institutionalization of both discursive models is problematic, as it's a target in the existing target-oriented, state-led, centrally planned approach. Both of these ways of, well, views of governance are confronted with the hierarchical authority and the traditional patterns of steering that send mixed signals about the policy solutions. So how do ideas translate into the institutions of governance? In the case of climate change mitigation, it has been largely well, translated or imposed or delivered by the international actors or governance agencies that were involved in production of climate change policies. And in Vietnam, as in the case of the previous socio-economic reforms, the discussion around green modernization is largely supported by the state actors, and here the reference made to the structural power of ideas, appealing to the cognitive value of the approaches. So ideas matter when they dominate the policy arena based on the appeal of the idea itself. So for instance, in Vietnam, so far appealing to the morality and responsibility and economic rationale of the cost efficiency of GHG emissions had been proved as the most successful policy for mainstreaming the climate change mitigation agenda in sectorial policies. While the green growth as greening the Dai Moi has been served as a justification for continuous state involvement in the development of climate change mitigation arena. So at the same time, the ideas are important when there is an increased pressure of the legitimacy of the existing discourse and institutions, for example, including the demands imposed by the liberalization of energy sector or the necessity to respond to the international requirements of climate change mitigation. So when the ideas also become important is at the time when there is a lack of strong alternative, or the strong alternative or any alternative is absent. So basically when ideas create this structural constraint on assemblage of positions and discourses that can be taken into consideration. Basically, if the dominant discourse, a dominant view on the policy making limits the participation of other actors or restricts their input. Ideas also matter when they become so-called coalition magnets. When actors when policy coalitions use ideas as informing, maintaining, and changing the coalition that support a specific institutional setup based on the shared vision of development. So the contribution of this project is three things. So empirically, it collects primary empirical data from one of the countries that had been among the first early movers in the global south to introduce the climate change mitigation wide national strategies, and it provides a snapshot of a specific period of time of the policy development. So analytically, to my knowledge, it's the first time the discourse of institutionalism and the conceptual framework had been applied in the context of domestic national policy development in the global south, and it contributes to three streams of literature. So it contributes to the constructivist accounts of climate change governance. It contributes to the institutionalist approaches, providing empirical example of when and how ideas become important, and it responds to the calls in social technical transition research to bring political and institutional analysis beyond the system perspective. So policy relevance, I hope there is some So one of the main suggestions this dissertation makes is that programs and policies need to reflect those realities of political and institutional context and the motivations for policy actions. So there is a need for better and improved in-depth institutional analysis prior to the interventions. So policymakers and policy advisors would benefit from reflecting on the assumptions embedded in policy choices. And, well, I've been told that reflexivity is probably not the right word and refers to physiological responses, but it's a case for revision and reconsideration of the assumptions, and, well, basically paying more attention to those. And it's important to keep in mind that governance of sustainability and climate change is not unproblematic, since there are a multitude of ways, and there is not presumably shared one vision about what it means. So the policy interventions and approaches need to be adaptable. Future research. Well, I do have some ideas. Well, one of the options is to look at the nexus between national and regional perspectives, and in particular how, for instance, informal networks challenge the centralized approach to renewable energy infrastructure, and regional and local perspectives of political drivers behind climate change and mitigation in the South is also one of the interesting areas of research. And, well, analytically and conceptually, discursive institutionalism can be one of those frameworks to look at what is referred in literature as climate opportunism. So as I gave it a lot of thought how my own positionality and me being a researcher impacted my the final outcome, and I take all the responsibility for errors and mistakes. So one of the things is, of course, complexity of working in a different culture. It's it's political, language, and communication, different culture. Like Vietnam is, well, I'm not a native Vietnamese speaker, and it's only one of those political environments that is complex and not that transparent and requires a lot of preliminary work. And I didn't have that much of experience, so I had to pay a lot of attention to that, and, well, obviously I have my limitations. Elite interviewing, which was chosen as a method to interview the policy actors, has its own caveats, such as, well, issues of access. It's not very easy to get access to the political actors, and it's not very easy to find those that actually have relevance in policy development, as, for instance, organizations often appoint people who, for the interviewing, who were not involved in the policy making, and also stakeholders' perceptions change. So relying on the accounts of the history of policy development also, well, has its own issues. And my research project has changed. The initial field work was designed for studying of institutional context, and well, because the process was iterative, I kept revising my questions, and well, if I had to do field work again, I would do it differently. And yeah, so there are lots of people I'm grateful and thankful for many different things, but as for now, those are 7 people that I'd like to express my gratitude for. And thank you for listening.